Good afternoon. I'm James Cantrell, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Chapter 16, Home Video. The commercial television industry pretty much began in 1941 in the United States, and it was left up to the Federal Communications Commission to develop the broadcast standards that we still use today. The first way that we received television broadcast signals was reception by the air, where the antenna picks up the broadcast signal and brings it to our televisions. And basically that's the way that we still received our television transmissions up until pretty much the 1970s. During World War II, though, pretty much all developments in relation to television broadcasting were halted because of the war efforts. And by the end of the war, there were only 6 broadcast stations that were still in existence. And there was still a law for quite a while, but during the time period between 1948 and 1952, that number expanded to about 100 different stations. Finally, in 1952, they realized that they needed to expand the number of stations that were possible, so they opened up the ultra-high frequency UHF frequency to add to the existing VHF frequency. Unfortunately, what that required, though, was a second tuner on most TVs so that they could pick up that signal. And then finally, in 1965, the FCC issued a all-channel receiver law in which all televisions needed to have dual tuners so that they could receive both VHF and UFH channels. Broadcast television was initially all in black and white, but color was added in 1953. And the good thing about the way they did color was that they just added it to the existing spectrum, and so it was compatible with the black and white TVs of the day. So that idea of reverse compatibility really helped color take its foot. Cable TV was introduced in 1949, but it wasn't really until the 1970s that new channels began to be introduced. And by 1992, there were about 105 national and regional networks that were in existence. However, by 2002, that number had gone up to 344. And it was during the time period of 1997 to 1999 that 111 new stations were added. In 1996, there were 145 satellite-delivered programming networks, and that number, by 2005, it went clear up to 565. So we see significant growth there in that type of networking. And then direct broadcast satellites began to surge after the 1992 Cable Act. And also, telephone companies were able to join in the market as a result of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Currently, less than 10 households in the United States receive their broadcast signals from terrestrial broadcast stations alone. So that means that they're using some type of satellite services to get some of their content. The 4 top broadcast networks, however, still receive 68 to 74% of the audience, which is a significant amount, especially in this day and age. However, the issue for them that they're finding is that they are getting a smaller cumulative audience between 2010 and 2011. Initially, all television shows were either live or they were put onto film. And it was eventually in 1956 that videotape technology was developed. However, that technology and the equipment for that technology was the size of a household refrigerator. So it wasn't really feasible to have in homes and really didn't take off until new forms were developed, which were Betamax and VHS, and those were developed in 1977. And there was a bit of a war going on between Betamax and VHS, and eventually VHS became the standard because they were able to fit pretty much an entire movie on one VHS, where Betamax would take several different tapes to be able to include one entire movie. By 1984, about 10% of the households in the United States had a VCR. That number jumped to 79% in 1994, and by 2006, the FCC estimated that 90% of households in the United States had a VCR. Now, video discs were first introduced in the 1980s, and the first video discs were really the size of LP records. So if you think about LP records and the size of those, that's how big the first video discs were. But they really didn't take hold until DVDs were introduced in 1997. And with DVDs, they could store an entire movie. They could store multiple language tracks, so they could have the movie dubbed in French, Spanish, whatever language that they choose. And there's also room then to include bonus content, which many of us have come to enjoy being included on the DVDs that we buy. Blu-ray is the high-definition version, and when that first came out, there was kind of a war, just like between Betamax and VHS. There was a war kind of going on between Blu-ray and HD DVD to determine which was going to be the standard. And Blu-ray could hold about 30 gigabytes of information, where HD DVDs could only hold about 9 gigabytes of information. So you can see having roughly 3 times the amount of information that could be contained on each disc obviously put Blu-ray at an advantage. And so we see that there's been a shift going from VHS to digital formats like DVDs and Blu-ray players. Since about 2003, we've seen that shift. And finally, DVDs began to be the dominant form in 2007. Now, DVRs are something that many of us have become familiar with having in our homes, and those were first introduced in 1999. And the interesting thing about DVRs is that they can play back multiple programs on various screens and record various programs at the same time. And they also provide an opportunity for us to have on-demand programming. The interesting thing about the DVR is that it is able to broadcast whatever you want to view to different parts of your house. So if you have TVs in different rooms, you can use that one DVR to show content on a variety of different displays. And we saw the penetration of DVRs grow from 2007 to 2013. And it pretty much leveled off about 48% of households. And really the main thought behind why that leveled off was because of the ability to access content through streaming and other on-demand options. Displays have changed tremendously since the first little black and white TVs, and by 1975, 95% of U.S. households had a television in them, and 66% of the people believed that they were a necessity item. So we can see how quickly they kind of took hold and became important in our households. The first TVs were cathode ray tube sets, and they used glowing lines of phosphorus to create the image. And the first standard was to have 525 different lines of those phosphorus images that would create the image that's displayed on the television. Finally, we are seeing as a result of the switch from analog to digital, that HD displays are becoming much more prevalent. In 2007, only 20% of households had an HD display. That number skyrocketed to 83% by 2013. And what they found is that switch happened from analog to digital, that people were adding displays to their home, adding television sets to their homes rather than replacing them. So maybe a house that was a one kind of TV set family grew to having multiple sets with that change. Households with multiple sets went from 75% in 2003 to 84% in 2012. Now, what I found interesting in our reading was that adult viewership has gone up on average 1 hour per day since 1998. So in 1998, women on an average watched 4.5 hours of television. Today, they're watching around 5.5 hours. Men, it went from 4 hours to 5 hours. But the interesting part about this is that child viewership has gone down. In 1988, 65% of 9-year-olds reported that they watched at least 3 hours of television per day. That number has dropped to 49% in 2002. So I think that that's just kind of interesting because it's in odds with what we traditionally think of, that kids are, just sitting around watching TV, not as active outside playing. Now, obviously, there are other factors such as video games and internet usage that have taken up some of that. But I just found that statistic to be rather interesting. Cable television penetration peaked at 71% in 2001, and by 2013, it had dropped to 59%. But alternative multi-channel services such as DirecTV, AT&T Uverse, those types of services grew to 32% in 2013. Recent developments that have occurred in the home video realm is that now, because we can pretty much choose the content that we want to watch and choose when we want to watch it, time shifting has occurred. We no longer have to sit down on Thursday night at 9 o'clock to watch our favorite show. We can DVR it, we can watch it later, or we can go and stream it a week or two later or whatever. But we are not bound to that programming schedule set up by the networks like we used to be. In 2013, streaming media accounted for 1 hour per week of all media that was taken in. So that number is pretty significant when you look at that. That's roughly 20 to 25% of the viewership that's occurring. Digital sales surged to over $1 billion in 2013. And so these are services like Hulu and Netflix and Amazon Prime, those types of service in which you can stream content to you on demand. In November of 2013, Blockbuster announced that it was closing the remaining 300 locations that it had. And during that same month, Hulu reported that they had 5 million paid subscribers. So things happened pretty quickly, going from where you would go to the video store, rent your video, bring it home, to being able just to simply select it through Netflix or Hulu and stream it directly to your TV. Consumers have more choice now than they've ever had. And so one of the things that you have to think about is what type of television that you want, what size it needs to be. And one of the things that you have to think about is the aspect ratio, which is the relationship between the width of the screen and the height of the screen. You also need to decide what size that you need. So one of the things that the book talked about was that determine how far away from the television that you're going to be sitting, and take that number, divide it by 2, take that number and also then divide it by 3, and that'll give you the range inch-wise to tell you whether you need a TV that's somewhere between 36 and maybe 42 inches. The types of monitors that we have changed quite a bit, and some of the upcoming things that we need to watch out for as being the new kind of technology is OLED. displays, and what's really cool about those is that lots of times they are flexible, and there's going to be lots of different uses I think that we'll see come about as those become more prevalent. And also we're going to see more integration between game consoles and smart TVs. We're also going to see that there's many different choices that we have regarding the way in which we receive content, and that those types of services are going to just continually grow. Time shifting is going to be a growing trend. One of the statistics that the book talked about was that in the top 25 markets, a quarter of the people watched programming at different times than what it was originally aired. So that's a pretty interesting thing to see, that many people in the top 25 markets are, watching the content other than when it initially airs. Finally, our options are ever changing, ever growing. We have large home theaters that people are putting into their homes, and the content providers have to look at that range. They have to look at, okay, are you watching stuff at home? And also, we know that people are watching more and more on their smartphones, on their tablets, and so they have to address the variety of different ways in which people are receiving content. So they have to adopt, the consumers have to adopt the different platforms that are out there, and it's the responsibility of the producers of the content to make sure that they have a business model that kind of suits the needs and works for everyone. So my question for you as a result of reading this chapter would be, what do you see the future of home video being? Will broadcast and traditional providers become a thing of the past? Do you think that they will continue to adapt and evolve so that they meet the ever-changing demands of the consumer? So share your thoughts with that, and thank you for listening.